Hello, and welcome to Federal Insight, presented by OA On Air, the official podcast of O'Neill & Associates. Federal Insight is a new series developed by the Federal Relations team with the goal to bring to you conversations, insights, funny anecdotes, and historical perspective as we look ahead. In addition to hearing from folks here at O'Neill, we will have guests such as former and current members of Congress, government leaders, staffers, and industry experts. Having worked remotely these past 18 months, one of the things I miss most has been sitting in our Vice Chairman's office, John Cahill, and listening to him share stories of his experiences, the workings and challengings behind the scenes, and the power dynamics during various legislative and historical moments over the years. I hope that our podcast can achieve that same expert insight and storytelling. In our first episode, John Cahill and I catch up with his friend and former client, Tom Kinton of Kinton Aviation Consulting. Tom Kinton worked for the Massport Authority for over 35 years, having ended his tenure there as CEO from 2006 to 2011. Equally important, 20 years ago this week, Tom Kinton was the aviation director when two airplanes that originated from Logan Airport were hijacked by terrorists on 9/11. In the ensuing days, it triggered major U.S. initiatives to combat terrorism in the wake of the worst aviation disaster in the world. Here's our conversation with Tom Kinton. Tom, thank you so much for joining us. And John Cahill, good to see you. I think we should just dive right in. So certainly we're approaching the 20th anniversary of 9/11. This is a wonderful opportunity to speak with you about your experiences as aviation director that day, and then certainly as CEO of Massport later on. But as far as the day of on 9/11, I think oftentimes, especially leading up to anniversaries, we ask colleagues or friends, where were you on 9/11? And I think it's less known that as you are the aviation director for the Massport Authority, your day, although usually you used to start out at Logan Airport like most days, in fact, you were not even at the airport or in the country the morning of 9/11. I'm not sure if you could share with us a bit more about, where you were when you learned about the two planes from Boston that were off the radar and how the subsequent events of the terrorist attack played out.
Sure. Correct. I was not in Boston. I had left for Montreal that Sunday to an airport conference that happened. It was an international conference of all airport directors from around the world. ACI runs an international conference every 5 or 7 years, and this happened to be an international. So I was up there with most of my fellow directors from the United States and around the world as well. And I remember it being Tuesday morning. I had called the airport, which is my normal routine before the day got started, to check in with Ed Frenny, who was my director of operations at the time, and said, "How are things going?" He said, "No problems, all good here. I'll see you tomorrow," which basically I was returning on Wednesday. I said, "Okay, keep things going. I'll see you in the morning," and hung up. And I was with a fellow colleague of mine at Massport in the exhibit hall of the conference, which was away from the hotel I happened to be staying at. And I heard somebody in the back mentioning a plane. They think they just heard a small plane hit one of the towers, one of the World Trade Center towers. So I said to Sam Slyman, who was my operations capital program person, I said, "Did you hear?" He said, "What?" I said, "Well, I think a small plane." He said, "You want me to call operations," meaning Massport operations? I said, "Yeah, give him a call, see if you got anything on it." So he called. I'll never forget the look on his face. He said, "They want to talk to you right away." And he handed me his phone. And he said, "Tom, all hell is breaking loose here." I said, "Well, what's the matter?" He said, "We've got one plane at the time, Flight 11, American 11. The tower can't contact it. We didn't know anything about striking the tower at the time. They weren't putting that together. They just said, plane's not answering. And it's off the radar because they turned the transponders off of these aircraft. The terrorists knew enough to turn the transponder off, which means with the transponder on, you're squawking, and ATC is picking up that radar blip, and they're tracking you. That's the way the system works. Well, they knew enough to shut it off, so now ATC sees American 11 disappear off the screen, and they don't know where it is because they're not tracking it. So I said, okay, I'm going to call Ed Frenny. So I hung up and I called Ed, and he said, yeah, we got a bad situation going on here. At this, he said, FAA Tower just called me and said they can't find 11, and they think it may have been the plane hit the World Trade Center. Now they're starting to piece things together. And I said, all right, make sure you get the Family Assistance Center and the Emergency Operations Center open. He says, already done. We're already moving on that direction. So the Emergency Operations Center, whenever there's a major incident, all internal and external agencies come together at the Massport Fire Station on the airfield. And everybody has an assigned seat. We practice this in drills year after year after year in the event of, God forbid, something bad going down. And sure enough, we're about to go through one of the worst days in the history of aviation. So I said, the Family Assistance Center is critical too, because if you recall, this is right in the aftermath of the TWA accident at JFK that blew up over Long Island, and there was a huge investigation that went on. But if you recall, there was a very bad scene with the families interacting with the media on public TV, and it was not good. So after that, the FAA and DOT came out with a mandate that all U.S. airports had to turn over family assistance to, not U.S. airports, airlines had to turn over family assistance to the American Red Cross to handle it until the care teams that the airlines all have, but sometimes they're at their hubs and they have to fly to the destination of the accident, so hours, if not days, can go by. So we actually practiced that and said, no, we're going to fill that void. Massport's going to fill that void in the event of an incident. So we had the Red Cross train our people. We had auditors, lawyers, other people who weren't first responders all get trained on how to interact with a family member and clergy and whatnot. And we set up the ballroom at the Hilton Hotel at Logan to be the Family Assistance Center. So a little bit of background on that. We were ready for it, and thank God we were, not knowing we were going to have 2 airplanes soon. So Family Assistance Center, Operations Center, and I said, I'm on my way. I'm getting out of here. I'm heading for the airport. So I'll never forget, I'm leaving the exhibit hall. I got a phone in one ear and a phone in the other ear. I'm talking to my secretary, and I'm still talking to Ed. And I'm saying, just get me on a flight. I don't care what you get me on, Don. Get me on a flight. So as we're moving there, we had to get back to the hotel and get our stuff. I said, meet here in 5 minutes, because another member of the staff, Gary Tobin, joined us. And I said, we're heading back. So I went up into my room and I'm packing. I flipped on the TV and I saw the second flight go in live, because now the major networks are covering this thing. Again, not knowing it's a Logan United 175, but the network was aghast. Oh my God, a second plane. So I, bad enough a first plane, but now I said, we're under attack. There's something radically wrong here. So we get downstairs. Now we're heading to the airport. The border's closing. Now the order has gone out by the FAA to ground everything. So now I got a closed border confronting me about an hour's drive from Montreal, because we ended up getting in a rent-a-car and saying, we're just going to drive. All right, we're just going to drive. I think we got the last rent-a-car. So it's 4 of us in the rent-a-car, and we just started heading to the border. So I called the state police, or had Ed Frenny work with the state police to get us across the border. And the way it ended up happening was they called me back and said, we've reached out to former Governor Cellucci, who happened to be the ambassador for Canada at the time. They know you're coming. You're all set. There's going to be a Vermont cruiser, state police cruiser on the other side to escort you down, I think it's Route 89. So sure enough, we got there. They said, who's Kinton? I said, that's me. They said, you need anything, sir? And I said, no, appreciate your cooperation and help. There's a restroom. I'd like everybody to avail themselves to that, because we've got a long drive ahead of us. And I finally got across. And oh, by the way, a little side note to this. As I entered Canada, as I left my house Sunday morning, I said to my wife, do I need a passport for Canada? Here I am, the aviation director. I'm supposed to know. Do I need a passport? She said, why don't you take it anyhow? So I grabbed it. When I got there Sunday and opened it, it was her passport.
No.
Yes. So here I am now trying to get out of the country on my wife's passport. So fortunately, my ID sufficed, my driver's license, and the fact that we had all the help from the state police and the former governor to get us across. But a little side note on things that really could have gone wrong in a different way. So anyhow, we meet the Vermont State Police officer, and he said, what do you need, sir? And I said, or he said, how fast do you want to go, sir? And I said, I want you to live and I want us to live. So go as fast as you can with that in mind. Thank you. So it was all lights and sirens down 89. We could only go 100 because the rent-a-car wouldn't go anymore, but we were moving pretty good. And we had a CNN radio station on, and I got phone intermittent cellular service. So we're picking up bits and details as we're driving, and we hear a second plane, and now confirmed it's a second one out of Boston, United 175. And there's another plane, maybe multiples. And we're hearing now the North Tower's collapsed, which was the second tower to be hit, incidentally, that came down first. So, and I was calling my wife too to let her know what was going on. And she said, please, you can't believe what's going on. It's terrible. So I said, don't worry, we're in good hands. And, you know, we're coming down 89, and now we hear the Pentagon's on fire. So I said, this is definitely a war. Something very, very bad and very wrong is happening here. So we continued down, we got to the New Hampshire border, and New Hampshire State Police picked us up at that point, gassed us up on their dime at one of the state police stations there. And then I was told by the state police at Logan that they had a plane waiting for me in Concord. They were going to fly me the rest of the way. So we diverted to Concord Airport, and Gary Tobin and I get on the state police plane. Sam continued with the other person down to Logan. So we flew the remainder of the way, and very, very eerie, because there was an F-16 on our left wing that I could look out at and see like I'm seeing you. And he gave me a thumbs up, and I gave him a thumbs up, and we continued to Logan. And landing at Logan, obviously there was nothing moving. We were the only airplane. And I remember my wife telling the story that she was outside talking to neighbors, and we flew right over Hanscom and Winchester area to get to Logan. And they said, I wonder who that is. Who's that Yahoo up there with the fighter jet? They said, that's Tom. So we landed at Logan, taxied immediately to the Emergency Operations Center, the fire station where I got out. This was about 1:30, 2 o'clock in the afternoon now. And I was met by Ed Frenny, the FBI, state police, and I was immediately briefed. Even before I got into the room, they showed me the manifest of the two flights, and it was, you know, you wanted to, you got sick to your stomach looking at it, because you could pick the names right off. And then they told me they had Atta's bag, because Atta, one of the lead terrorists, 11, believed to be the one at the controls, flew in that morning from Portland, Maine, and thinking he was going to land behind security at Logan. But if those of you remember or recall, it's still the same, Logan Airport terminal, although you can connect now behind security. Back in the day, you couldn't. So he landed on US Airways Express on the US Airways side of Terminal B, only to find out he had to go through security again. So he had to cross the street, go through the parking garage, and redo security clearance at Logan, and made the flight, but his bag never made it. His bag misconnected, okay? The US Airways Express never got his bag onto 11. So that was a vital piece of evidence. I said, well, what's in the bag? And they opened it up and they showed me. There was the flight manuals for 767, and there was the Quran. So right off the bat, we knew first of all, no pilot would ever do that, even with a gun to their head. But that was hard evidence that terrorists were flying these airplanes, because we had a flight manual on how to fly a Boeing 767 in the Quran. So we had crucial evidence right off the bat. From that point, I was briefed on several other things. Went into the operations center, showed everybody how it worked, doing their thing. Asked how the Family Assistance Center was going. They said it's fine. The families are there. Airlines aren't there yet, just as I had suspected, which they couldn't be. I mean, American was coming from Dallas. They have a care team, professionally trained care team for these accidents. Was coming from Dallas.
Was United coming from Chicago?
United was coming from Chicago, I believe, John. Yes, and United got there at 10 o'clock that night. American didn't get there until 9 the next morning. So Massport was doing the critical interface with the families for a good period of time. And the credit that goes to those people is enormous, because when the airlines got there, their request of us was, can we have your people stay with us, please? They're doing such a great, there was a rapport already developed with the families and our people. So the professional airline people asked for our people to stay on, which was a great compliment to their training in advance of something like this. So from there, I was dragged off to a press conference, my first press conference, which was, over at the Hyatt Hotel. I was driven to the Hyatt Hotel, and when I pulled into the parking lot, I couldn't believe the amount of satellites and various news media that was there. The ballroom was packed with media, and TVs were breaking in live, because events were still unfolding on that terrible day of now World Trade Centers, 2 from Boston, Pentagon, 1 out of Dulles, and the Shanksville crash out of Newark. So 4 aircraft that we knew that were airborne with terrorists on board. 3 hit their targets. The 4th didn't, thanks to the brave people on board that took it down over Pennsylvania. But the theory is that was headed for the Capitol or the White House. They think more the Capitol, because it's a tall enough structure that you can hit. So now it was back to day-to-day operations, with me dealing with Washington FAA. We're on calls all the time with Washington FAA, with security, searching our terminals, because we didn't know if things were booby-trapped, searching planes that never got off the ground that morning, that had to turn around and go back to the gate, because nobody knew if there were terrorists on board other aircraft. So we searched and researched every aircraft, looking for weapons. And by then, by the way, we knew the weapons were razor blades, box cutters, because of the brave flight attendants on board, Amy Sweeney and Betty Ong on American, who back in the day, John, you'll recall the seatback phones.
Yes.
They were kneeling behind the seats in the back, and they picked the phone up and they called their ops center in Dallas. One of them called their lead in Boston to say, we've been hijacked. There are passengers in first class that have had their throats cut, and the crew, I believe, is also compromised. And we're way too low, and we're going way too fast. And, there was no mention of any guns. There was no mention of any Uzis. What was reported at one point along the way, that they had stolen Massport IDs and Uzis, all crazy stuff, but it was simply razor blades.
Right.
And the fact that the crew back then would exit the cockpit to try to quell a disturbance and leave the first officer or the captain to fly the airplane. And that sadly led to the demise of the crew members because of the access, which then got quickly changed by the feds to the armored cockpit doors to prevent anything or preclude anything from that happening in the future. But it was, working with the FBI, trying to retrace the steps of the terrorists in Boston. We knew 4 came from in a rent-a-car that later was reported to us that they had an altercation in the central garage that morning because They opened their door and inadvertently, I'm sure, hit the person's door next to them. That person exited the car and, got into a verbal exchange, but it was only led by him because they didn't answer. They simply sat there, 4 people still, never moved, never said anything. This person continued on to their flight, later got grounded during the FAA order to bring every aircraft down, understood what was happening, called Logan State Police and said, go check this car. There was something fishy. Sure enough, it was a rent-a-car. There were 4 terrorists that came that were going on the United flight. The United 175 terrorists were in that car. They didn't want to blow their cover by getting into an altercation, so they kept silent as our guests. And so we retraced that. We found the car. Some came by taxi cab, stayed at local hotels, and Otter and his companion came via Portland, having gone through security there, and then redid security, as I said earlier, having landed on the US Airways side of Terminal B. And we later found out they also made phone calls to each other before they boarded their aircraft from payphones at the American terminal, the United terminal, apparently saying it's a go. The operation was on. So later, obviously we're having many press conferences, many meetings, security. The system is still grounded. The whole United States air system is grounded. We towed 3,000 cars out of the Terminal B parking garage because, again, not knowing if any cars were compromised with booby-trapped. Those parking spaces are very close to the terminal, so we wanted to get them out of there. So we towed them up to Suffolk Downs. So we towed 3,000 cars and secured the airport and searched it to the best of our ability, finding nothing, thankfully. And, there was all kinds of questions about security, why Logan? And, I'm the #1 footnote in the 9/11 Commission report. And my answer to the question on why Logan is because it was a geographical decision by terrorists, as was Newark, as was Dulles, to fly airplanes that they knew how to fly, that were fully loaded with fuel, in that case in the morning, heading west. And in Boston's case, going close to the targets, be it the World Trade Center. And sure enough, the crystal clear, beautiful fall or late summer day gave them the opportunity to simply follow the Hudson River, which was their guide, to these 2 towers sticking up in the air. And a trained pilot will tell you, because they only knew how to fly at altitude, they didn't know how to put flaps out, they didn't know how to slow it down. So they flew those airplanes almost at 500 knots. And to hit a target like that, which is like a needle in the sky, is not very easy to do, and they did it. They not only hit it, but they also tilted their wings and went through 15 stories, rather than if they went straight in, it might have been 3 stories. And so we all know the people above were trapped because the stairwells and elevators were taken out. There was no way for them to get down based on the way they entered the buildings. And the fuel, again, fully loaded with fuel, all that fuel just spilled down the elevator shafts and the stairwells into the basements, and then burned and eventually melted the steel which supports that building, melted it enough that it lost its stability and both collapsed. Same thing with Dulles. They were going past their target and they made a quick turn to come back to the Washington, D.C. And in Newark's case, it would have been a quick turn. And they had made that turn over Pennsylvania or were heading back to Washington, D.C. when they were taken out by the passengers on board. So again, to us, it was a geographical decision, not certain airports because of certain lack of security or anything like that. It was just strategic, had the airplanes, had the fuel, and was close to the targets they were after. I mean, think about it. If they had gone to Chicago or the next major set of airports where those types of planes would be at, they'd have to turn around and fly a long way east. And maybe things would have changed when the fighter jets scrambled, because the fighter jets did scramble finally, but it was too late. They scrambled out of Barnstable here locally and raced to New York, only it was too late. And by that time, they had been given orders that if any aircraft were threatening major cities, that they were ordered to shoot them down, believe it or not. I'm not sure that would happen on the first aircraft or before any accident occurred, but once these accidents started happening, we knew we were up against, so I think the order was justified, but never executed.
Tom, talk a bit about, as we proceed, in the ensuing days, proceed to the ensuing days, talk about the setup, the structure for security, responsibilities for security at airports. And obviously we changed that with the creation of Homeland Security and TSA, but in those days it was different. Do you want to just describe that so people have a context on this?
Sure. The security responsibility of the security checkpoints it was an airline responsibility. So American had responsibility for their security checkpoint. They hired the security contractors. They were held accountable by the FAA, not Massport, by the FAA to do that security. Similarly, United was held, any airline was held accountable for security checkpoints. And in Terminal C case, it was United that was responsible. So, that was later, Massport had security responsibilities. I'm not saying we didn't. We had perimeter security responsibilities. We had security responsibility of the airfield, fire crash crew rescue responsibilities for the airfield, security badging responsibilities as dictated by the FAA. All minimum standards, by the way. You could exceed those, which Massport did in many, many cases. And that was made clear through the 9/11 Commission when we had to testify on behalf of Massport. It was also made clear in the Marshall Commission, the Carter Commission that was locally done by the state. And we worked with our elected delegation. I mean, I can't say enough about Senator Kerry, Senator Kennedy for their support. And to your specific question about security, I think we were the first, Massport was the first to go public saying this needed to be federalized.
Yeah.
Not that anybody did anything wrong, but the game changed that morning. The game changed dramatically, where this was an act of war. And to have private security companies working for airlines, it needed to look more like border security, is the way I termed it. It had to look more like customs and immigration. So there was one entity that was dealing with all security for U.S. airports. So there's no excuse for nobody not talking to one another and not sharing intelligence and whatnot. So I'm not saying it was because of us, but we did call for that. And it later was stood up as the Homeland Security Department. To this day is the TSA that does the security. So the responsibility no longer rests with the airlines. It's a federal government responsibility.
To that point, there were sort of two things I wanted to say, but one goes directly to the change in terms of security and our stand on we need to do this and we need state-of-the-art equipment to do it. We need to outfit not only the checkpoints at the terminals, but the baggage screening, etc. And so about, as soon as we could fly, I suppose, whatever it was, 2 to 3 weeks after 9/11, I arranged a meeting with a fellow at DOT because, there was no TSA and there was no DHS yet, but DOT had hired Randy. You might remember his name, Tom. He was a consultant to DOT. Yeah. Randy, he was very, very good, and it was very fortunate for us that he was that good. And I'll tell you why. So I set up, probably using Senator Kerry's good offices, I set up a meeting with him for Leslie Kerwin, who was our ANF director, and Betsy Taylor, who pitched the idea. And you could speak about how this came about internally. I was sort of the facilitator externally and arranged this thing to say, look, we're going to need this equipment. And Randy, of course, knew it existed and was accessible, but it was going to be extremely expensive to do the whole airport.
Yep.
So we flew down and Matt made the pitch, and he was, as I say, he was good. in the meeting, this is an interesting factoid. In the meeting, there was an assistant secretary for policy. And this is the 9th month of the Bush-Cheney administration. And you guys recall that Dick Cheney, who became vice president, had also been chief of staff to a president and secretary of defense. There wasn't much he didn't know about the federal government. So one of the steps he took on behalf of the administration was to appoint, in many, many cases, an assistant secretary for policy in different departments. This happened to be DOT. We happened to be there as an airport operator to discuss the acquisition of equipment with the feds footing the bill, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And so in the midst of the meeting, this fellow who's an assistant secretary for policy speaks up and says, it's unclear to me why the federal government has to pay for this equipment. I don't understand why can it be you and the airlines, which was an incredible diversion from the point of the day. This is basically within 21 days of 9/11, and this fellow is saying this, and I could see the look on Randy's face on the thing. And I had to say, I turned to the guy, I said, the security, in the case of national defense, is the responsibility of the federal government. It's not the responsibility of a city-owned or state-owned airport. This is how it works. And that gave me the clue that this fellow had never worked in transportation ever.
Yep.
He had no idea how these things work. So the meeting proceeded. Clearly, we made tremendous progress. We're right on the path to get something approved. And we shored it up, of course, with the good offices of Senator Kennedy and Senator Kerry, et cetera. But as I was leaving the meeting, and you will appreciate this now, but as I was leaving the meeting, I went over and reintroduced myself and spoke to this fellow for a few minutes. And lo and behold, his background was in the mining industry.
Oh, jeez.
And he was from Wyoming.
Wow. Is that right?
Wyoming.
Well,
so he was handpicked.
Right.
Handpicked, okay?
But, well,
and I don't think his view of the world ever changed. In other words, if it was up to him, we never would have received that $130 million worth of
135 million, yeah. Well, that's a very interesting point, John, because if you look at the evolution of security at airports, there was no security during the Cuban hijacking days, right? You went on board, and that's where all the guns were going, and people were being hijacked and flown, aircraft were being flown to Havana and so forth. So security checkpoints were established to look for guns thereafter, okay? That evolved over the years, looking for bombs, looking for guns still, or any other kinds of weapons. But to your point, on one of the things that came out, once we literally had to tear up the security plans because the world changed, okay? It wasn't just the security checkpoints now that needed to change. But to your point, whole baggage screening, even to that point, despite Pan Am 103, which had a bag in the belly of the 747 that went down over Lockerbie, there was still no requirement to screen luggage. And people were appalled when they heard that, because now everybody's sort of focused on security, which rightly so. And we made the determination that feds or not, we're going to screen it. Okay, even though we fought and went down there with your services and whatnot, got the money, but we were going to do it anyhow because it was time. And we put a team together to work 24/7. The contractors, they were great. Everybody treated it like a war effort, which it was. And we stood up, and I think in 6-month time, the ability with the technical equipment, because it wasn't just the equipment. We had to build places to put the equipment, bring power, because these things take high voltage to bring all the power, build the rooms to house the equipment for the TSA, build the rooms where the bags that get rejected to be hand searched and further searched that were being rejected by the technology. So yes, many, many changes came out of it, even though a bag bomb was not related to 9/11. It was just another potential security flaw that needed to be corrected, and it was corrected. FAA then mandated by a date certain that all U.S. airports had to have whole baggage screening. So it was not just Boston, but everybody had to end up doing it. But we were down there, as you say, within 2 weeks after 9/11, making the point.
Yeah. And I think up till that point, there was some procedure between the FAA, the airlines, and of course the contractors, where the FAA would get approximately $50 million a year to deal with the, obviously they weren't doing baggage screening, whole baggage screening, but at the checkpoints. And it's still unclear to me how that was distributed. I just remember the number because it was obvious the number was too small.
Yeah,
You
yes.
could not possibly support 300 airports across the United States with $50 million worth of investment per year.
Exactly.
And you couldn't then, and on top of it, and we've gone through this now a couple of times, Tom, you couldn't even upgrade because no sooner you'd spend the 50, 5 years would go by, you should have better equipment.
Better equipment,
How do you get the better equipment? Well, the system's only getting 50 million a year. So that had to be dealt with. And it obviously, once DHS was created, I think in the fall, winter of 0102, I think I'm right about that. It took some time. Then, of course, the TSA established legit budget targets for these things.
That's right.
And they were realistic, thank God.
Yeah, I mean, and that brings up another point of liability. Talk just a couple of minutes about liability. I mean, obviously, there were lawsuits brought here, as there should be, but they were brought against just about everybody. Massport, New York, New Jersey Port Authority, Metropolitan Washington Port Authority, the airlines, the manufacturer of the airplanes, manufacturer of the engines on the airplanes, the security checkpoint company. I mean, everybody.
Yeah.
And these lawsuits went on for years, but thank God for the 9/11 settlement fund commission, if you will, that was put in play that had monies that were being donated by the citizens of the U.S. And others, that the settlements were made outside of court to most 99.9% of the families. A couple of families stayed in there for quite a while. I mean, Massport, I remember testifying, never got to court, but I remember going to a deposition and testifying for 7.5 hours, arguing or pushing back on accusations that were being made about Massport. But ultimately, the judge threw out Massport out of the case, said there's no reason for Massport even to be in this case. Why are they here? Asking the other lawyers. But that took over 7 years.
Sure.
And that decision was finally made that we were divorced of any responsibility as a result of, Carter Commission report, 9/11 Commission report, our own testimony, and a judge looking at the facts saying, hey, there's no reason for Massport to be involved here. So unless you can convince me otherwise, they're out of here. So we were, as I say, divorced from any further actions. But it took a long time to get there.
I was going to say, I talked to Jen about this, that another thing that stood in the way of that, and is very, very difficult, was that the airlines, shortly after 9/11, I don't want to put days on it, but maybe a couple of weeks, pursued indemnification protection.
Yes.
Themselves. We get word of that, or somehow we get word of it. Maybe Mike calls to DC or something. And I called Dick Meyer, God rest him, who was the head of insurance for Massport, internal, smart as could be. We talked about it for exactly 4 minutes, and he said, you better come over here. We're going to have a meeting on this thing. This is not good. Particularly with, on top of the airlines pursuing it. And, it's sort of like who's left standing. I don't want to be brusque about it, but that's the reality. If one entity gets protection and another entity gets protection, and you don't, you're way out there. So you were there. I think you were there. Myself, Mackey, who was the new general counsel at the time, had only been in the job for 3 weeks. Bannard, Dave Bannard.
Yeah.
You remember? Terrific attorney. And Meyer. And we talked about it, and obviously the twist of the thing was we needed to feel out whether there was some way we could get at least immediate, particularly if the airlines are doing this, immediate insulation, indemnification on these events. very, very difficult thing to broach, as you guys might imagine, in that environment, so soon too, after 9/11.
Yeah.
But that being said, I went down and talked with Kerry directly, and despite the atmosphere, he empathized completely and understood the implications that have been laid out to us, you, me, and others, that this could be a paralyzing thing for the authority and would prevent us from virtually operating, but certainly issuing bonds. You know, it could just freeze the entire entity. And by the way, and put the Commonwealth in jeopardy, because if the Port Authority can't handle it, then the Commonwealth is going to have to step up. So Kerry was very, very good. Kennedy was very supportive. I went over to talk to the House committee folks, and they were really up to date on what the airlines were trying to do. And look, the airlines are trying to survive. I mean, you remember the stock price of American Airlines 2.5 weeks after?
Yeah.
You and I could have bought the airline.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just insane. So I spoke to them, and they were very up to date on the thing, and empathized and said, well, let's see what you can do in the Senate, because John Kerry was on the Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee in the Senate with jurisdiction over aviation. So needless to say, a lot of conversations, cooperative. I went back to the House guys. I said, there's one thing that's sort of troublesome. Because of the disaster with the towers, and Jen, I know, has the statistics on this, it wiped out innumerable senior staff for the New York, New Jersey Port Authority.
Right.
We're not really even capable at that moment of expressing a position or point of view on virtually anything. And
it was 84 employees, including 37 Port Authority police officers, their executive director, their superintendent for the police. They all, passed away because that's where their headquarters was. So.
Yeah. So the House folks were kind enough to, as everyone's taken the steps to give some protection, they were kind enough to include New York, New Jersey in that, even though New York, New Jersey really was not able to say much. So anyway.
No, that you raise another point in memory here that I do recall Dick Meyer and you talking to me, and I went into a meeting with Senator Kennedy and Senator Kerry at the Emergency Operations Center, because they came there, and with Jenny Buckingham. And I walked in, and I can remember to this day, they both said, what do you need? What do you need, Tom? And I raised this liability issue, and I said, my understanding is there's legislation pending, or it's about to happen, or may have happened, where the airlines and others are looking for it. I said, Massport, as well as these other airports, need to be part of that, in all due respect, or you're going to have the scenario that you just described unfold. And they got it. They got it and went to work. So.
Yes, they did. They did it. They did a terrific job. Banner did a great job on our language, what was needed, and really exceptional in that, given the environment at the time, to have to even think about this.
I know.
Really tough, so.
You're absolutely right. Not the easiest thing to think about, but, you mentioned opening the airports. Airports opened, that was Tuesday the incident occurred. Airports opened Thursday afternoon with a variety of very strict restrictions and new security amendments that kept coming. I mean, they were coming out multiple amendments daily for weeks, if not months, as we rebuilt the security plan for the U.S. airports. But I raised that point only because we stayed closed until Saturday. And there were many questions why, and I think I described earlier, I wanted to make sure, as did top-notch security people, that we had every chance of any booby trap or anything that terrorists may have left behind, that we turn that place upside down to ensure that wasn't the case, number one. And then number two, MWA, they didn't open national until weeks later.
Weeks later. When I flew down, at least the two first occasions of flying down there, which was a couple of weeks after, we had a flight at Dulles.
Yeah.
had to fly to Dallas. And you're right. National, I don't think opened for 6 weeks or something really amazing.
Yeah, Reagan stayed closed. And then when they did open, we had to put special restrictions in. Not only did you have to go through all those security protocols to get through security, but then you had to be isolated at the gate that was going to Reagan National. And dogs that were there, the state police dogs and TSA and others doing other kinds of searches, secondary yet again, just to ensure that we had multiple layers of security in place here. And, the other point is we brought the Israelis in, just to mention that as a side note, that
Rafi Ron.
Yep. Nobody does it better, and we need to have, I think, the best in the world. Ginny Buckingham brought it to me, and I said, let's do it. And they were great. I mean, great because he was great because he knew he couldn't turn Logan into Tel Aviv.
Right.
Okay, he got that. But we took the best we could take from Tel Aviv and introducing the various layers of security, implemented them, and I hinted at this earlier, going above and beyond the federal mandates, that we've done much more than that over the years relative to security, a lot of which can't be talked about because it would be security if we advertised what we were doing, but it's still going on to this day as a result of, and by the way, you mentioned the point of technology changing. That has to evolve because the threat evolves.
Mm-hmm.
You can't have these machines 5 years old with a new threat out there. You have to evolve these technology as the threats evolve, and thank God we're doing that now, and have been doing it as a federal government, because that's the only way to defend it. Because as you said, it's a federal, it's a threat to the United States of America, not a threat to Logan Airport or Dulles or individual airports. It's a threat to this country that has to be met with a response from the federal government.
Absolutely, it's a defense issue. You're defending the country.
Yep.
And I don't think we'd ever want to get in a situation again where the city of Cleveland has to be responsible for all the security at Hopkins Airport. I mean, that makes no sense to me. So, but it has evolved, thank goodness. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was going to say, Tom, you hinted that, Massport and Logan particularly went above and beyond. And I think that really became a national example. And I know a lot of times airports and security personnel have come to kind of learn from the folks at Massport. Can you talk a little bit more about the importance of that? I think it was started at or just soon after 9/11, the 8:30 a.m. Daily briefing that was created, and certainly some of the, I think even too, I looked up, there was an innovation behavior recon program that you all kind of implemented. That was something that was a big deal, certainly after 9/11.
Yeah, very, very good point. So much happened. We implemented a daily 8:30 briefing. We used to meet with the airlines routinely, but as I said, things were changing so fast and so much. But even to take a step back from that, Logan got hit hard. We got hit hard. I mean, the worst nightmare for an aviation director is to lose one airplane. I lost two that morning. And they took the World Trade Centers down. Not my wildest dreams would I ever imagine anything like that happening. So we felt, even though, there was blame going around, it eventually got cleared, thankfully, but we also felt the responsibility to rebuild our security to be the best, okay? Because, we got hit hard, and in many cases, we didn't wait for the federal government to catch up. That's not a criticism of the federal government. They're dealing with, as John said, 300 airports. Yeah. People in California are going, what are you talking about?
Right.
It didn't happen to them. It happened to us. And so there's a different feeling when it hits you. So we were implementing things over and above, and we did it even after the FAA and DOT and TSA stepped in and said, you will and you must and you have to. To this day, we exceed that dramatically, and for good reason. And we felt a responsibility, and it was sort of rebuilding the spirit of the airport as well, because people, again, felt a lot of hurt based on what happened. And out of that, again, because information was coming so quickly and things were happening so fast, we have to have an 8:30 meeting every morning. Airlines, TSA, Massport, State Police, Fire Department, hotel security, security companies, because then there were still security companies running these checkpoints. TSA hadn't get stood up yet. So we had standing room only in the media room every single morning at 8:30, and we were sharing information of what happened the previous 24 hours, and we were looking at the next 24 hours. We weren't trying to look ahead 6 months or a year, because things were happening and things were so fluid. We were only looking at yesterday, today, and tomorrow. To this day, that meeting still happens, and the room is still in overflow, believe it or not. And that's the kind of sort of spirit that's behind not just Massport, but all of the private sector operators, the hotels, as I said, the airlines, the TSA, the federal government. They're still all in that room every single day, almost 20 years later.
Wow. Incredible.
It is amazing how an event can change the conduct of industry and government. You know, that you usually look at things through, well, what if there's an event? What are we going to do?
Mm-hmm.
Clearly, in this case, the event dictated what we have had to do.
Yep.
And all these changes we've discussed, and even more than we haven't discussed. So the impact, besides emotionally, the impact has been enormous.
Yeah, and you know, obviously, we're still a target. This country, we read about it and see it on the news every day, and unfortunately, we're still a target. We cannot let our guard down. We must not let our guard down. We have to evolve with the threats and stay ahead of them, which is not an easy thing to do, but you have to stay ahead of these threats because they're growing each and every day. I mean, just look at the World Trade Centers. They tried to take that down, I think in 1996, with the garage, the bomb. They didn't give up. They didn't give up, obviously. They came back with another plan.
So be alert, be on your guard.
That's exactly right.
Well, appreciate you taking the time, you know, to meet with us today. And it was very interesting. I learned a lot that I did not know about, and I don't know if most folks did. So I appreciate everything you did then and for talking with us today.
Great. Thank you as well, and stay safe.